One of the things we also heard this week, it's not going to take one vendor to address security. It's going to take like people, all of us here, working across companies, across industry to make a positive dent into security all up. So I really much look forward to interacting with all of you today. Ideally, I would appreciate this to be a conversation rather than just me presenting, which is why towards the end, I'll also leave plenty of time so we can also have hopefully some questions and answers. And I also have some prizes to give away. I'm also particularly interested in understanding how organizations not just grow their cyber talent, but also how they support it and what they do to retain it. What I'm looking forward to share with you today, it's very applicable. I work on the front lines, like many of you. Although I'm a product manager with a specific high-tech company, today you're not going to hear anything about the technology side of the things. Moreover, a lot of what I'm going to share with you today, you can actually apply different vendors to it. My intention is, after we finish today, for you to get real value out of this conversation and to hopefully have a little bit of a better understanding how some other companies are approaching cloud infrastructure security. And more, I would like to think importantly what you can do to make a positive dent in your overall security posture. So what I thought I would do is touch on briefly a couple of examples I brought with me today about some attacks I observed in the real world. Without mentioning any company names, I'm going to share with you what happened, what could have been done to prevent it, what was the impact to the company itself, and then I also want to touch upon cloud infrastructure security and one of the core concepts of it. And that is having any kind of cloud infrastructure security at all requires something referred to as security hygiene. So I want to share with you what that is. I want to share with you how that's applicable to environments big and small. I also want to share with you some resources and services I see targeted more than others, especially with regards to particular misconfigurations on them. So we're going to go into more depth around that, particularly for organizations that are adhering to more than one public cloud provider. So can I see a show of hands? How many of you are using at least one public cloud? Okay, interesting. Are there any of you that are using more than one public cloud provider? 2? When it comes to multi-cloud, it's particularly interesting because you need to adhere to security best practices that tend to be implemented slightly different when you compare different public cloud providers. So we can also touch upon that as well. Now, I'd be remiss if this conversation was only about deployment, because there's much more to it when we need to secure resources. That's why I want to also open the conversation up to DevSecOps. And there, I also want to discuss with you the integration with pre-deployment. When I look, however, organizations that do cloud infrastructure security better than others, and I typically work with Fortune 500 companies who are big, some would say somewhat slow, but they're also quite complex. So I have a sense of what works well and what, again, works less well. When I see organizations that approach cloud infrastructure security in a better way, a big part of it, it's also leadership. So it's not just having the technology, and it's also about the processes and people, those 3 pillars that the industry also tends to speak about. So I look also forward sharing with you today, when it comes to sponsorship, leadership, delegation, what some companies are doing that makes them stand out and makes them better than others. I'd like to start our conversation today around cloud infrastructure security with something I believe goes to the very core of it, and that's security hygiene. For those of you that ever ask yourself, what is actually security hygiene? I brought the definition today with me by NIST, by the US National Institute for Standards and Organizations. Now, NIST describes security hygiene as implementing a few steps to address misconfigurations that cause many common cybersecurity incidents today. Effectively, by implementing these few simple practices or steps, you can ensure that your cloud infrastructure is hardened, meaning it's harder for attackers then to compromise your public cloud environment. There are a lot of different security hygiene definitions out there. I'm sure using your favorite search engine, you can also look one up. The reason I decided to bring this one from NIST with me today was purposeful. I believe NIST captured the gist of cloud infrastructure security correctly. You see, NIST mentioned it's a few practices that can be done to address many common misconfigurations. Now, why does this matter? And I brought two real-world examples of attacks with me today to hopefully shed a little bit more light as to the importance of security hygiene and cloud infrastructure security all up. First example you see from the top, an organization had resources deployed that didn't adhere to security best practice guidance. The outcome of which was also that certain resources were accessible over the internet. Now, there are obviously use cases around resources being publicly accessible, and we can go into more about that as well. And there are also folks that would argue, just if something is publicly accessible doesn't necessarily represent a risk to my environment. While that may be true in this particular case, the resources in question also had vulnerabilities on them. Now, this changes the narrative, because now I not just only have a resource that's publicly exposed, but that there is something vulnerable on that resource. Meaning anyone can access it, including threat actors. But now they can also take advantage of an exploit to gain an entry point and foothold into my environment. If you ever ask yourself, does this really happen? I can tell you for a fact it does. And it affects companies big and small, be it Fortune 500, be it a small and medium-sized business. The challenge here is, like any threat actor, once they gain a foothold, they're obviously looking around themselves, what else is here that I can actually infect? So they tend to do what's referred to as spread laterally. I decided to bring this example with me today, the first one, because it also breaks the common misconception or myth that if an attack starts in one public cloud, that it always stays there. That's not the case. In this case, they were able to go from one public cloud and one particular type of resource to a database in a different public cloud provider. They were eventually able to get a hold of a storage account and then exfiltrate sensitive information from the organization. The second example of a real-world attack, it's unfortunately different, so the tactics and techniques used are different. Here, we are speaking about something that an open source component that had a dependency on a vulnerable artifact, so a library. Now, because of that, the attackers and threat actors were able to exploit that, again, to get a foothold into the environment. This time, they didn't actually target what I refer to as the more traditional compute resources. So think of your VMs and databases, like in the first example. This time, they actually went for the code, and they were able to then set up a malicious image into a container registry, which is a resource inside of cloud that just holds your images that you're going to deploy into your containerized environments. So by having a malicious image, they were able then to also deploy it into the containerized environment and the clusters. Now, what they did then is they employed a crypto miner. But unfortunately, this wasn't the end. We've seen that crypto miners in the past have been a very successful vehicle for delivering ransomware, which is what eventually happened in this example as well. Now, there are a couple of different things we can also address here, but one of the things we see clearly early on that all of these attacks were made possible by misconfigurations in the public cloud. What I believe can really help here when you go about thinking of how to improve your overall posture or your overall cloud infrastructure security in any kind of a public cloud nowadays is you probably already do this. A lot of organizations do. Yours probably as well. They tend to refer to this as having a security baseline or any baseline. The gist behind having a baseline is you already have a set of practices that you have in place to ensure that any kind of a resource that's deployed into the cloud gets deployed in a secure manner and that it's configured properly. What I aim to share with you today is that not all services are created equal, especially from a threat actor's point of view. I see some resources being targeted more than others. And it's not due to them being databases, or it's not them being compute that makes them being targeted. I see them being targeted because they have riskier misconfigurations compared to the others. So what are some resources I observed that have the riskiest misconfigurations out there in the real world? This is by no means meant to be an extensive list. There are many more, but from my own personal experience, I saw storage being a big one. And I'm sure you can also find examples of data breaches, including or that have started with storage resources being either misconfigured using one of your favorite search engines. There are plenty to go around. I also see identities as a big one, especially identities that are over-permissioned and are not adhering to something the industry refers to as the least privilege principle, which in essence mean I just have the necessary permissions I need to do my day-to-day activities. If I have more than that, imagine like admin permissions all the time, then if someone compromises my account, they can actually take control of the entire environment. I also see Kubernetes, so containerized environments, being riskier than some other resources due to their inherent nature. There are specific components inside of a Kubernetes cluster that have more privileges than others. So meaning if I am able to compromise, let's say a privileged container, I can then look to escalate permissions and privilege. I can then take control of the cluster itself, meaning I could then deploy my crypto mining or ransomware software. Then we also have serverless, so things like functions. But I also observed the more traditional, I'll call it cloud infrastructure resources, so your compute and databases. When it comes to detecting all of this, now companies big and small have a huge challenge because in reality they're not able to remediate all misconfigurations. We definitely live in a time where organizations big and small. So I'll give an example, Fortune 500 companies. You would think, well, if we are a smaller organization, then probably, the bigger ones have bigger teams. They can, remediate everything. In reality, that's not the case. So organizations need to do more with less, meaning they're not able to remediate everything. So the question then becomes, what do you then remediate? I'd like to offer a perspective that you should look to remediate misconfigurations on your cloud infrastructure resources based on risk. Risk specific to your environment. Risk can be defined as what you see here, business impact multiplied by exploitability. So you identify what are the resources that you have deployed in the cloud that are important to your organization or your business. Then you look at what's exploitable on them. Now, exploitability can mean different things. I included a couple of them here, like vulnerabilities, both known and unknown, so even zero-day attacks. And then sensitive data. Now, this is particularly true for organizations that are in the process of moving to the cloud, where you might have one department inside of the organization that starts all of a sudden move resources and data to the cloud, and then you're like, whoa, what are all of this sensitive information we have in the cloud? Because the department who moved the data into the cloud wasn't even aware that they were moving sensitive data. Now, if you have misconfigurations on cloud resources that contain sensitive data, you can understand how that can actually be a big problem for any organization. Internet exposure, again, is another one, but I always would encourage you to think what else. because you can always have resources that are exposed to the internet. But when you look at what else is out there, do they have overly permissioned identities, secrets, etc., that can really then be even more exploitable. What's interestingly enough, you have a lot of different vendors in this space that have different ways to help you prioritize risk. It can be either based on a security KPI, more than one. It can be even based on criticality. I want to share with all of you that no vendor out there knows your environment better than you do. No one. Now, you might be working with a partner. They even know your environment better than a vendor does. So I'd like to encourage you to think, what else here do you consider exploitable in your specific environment? Because I'm sure you can add more things to the list as well. Then ideally, as you go about identifying those resources that you need to remediate first based on business impact and vulnerability, ideally you should always feed this back into how do these resources tend to get deployed moving forward. A lot of organizations refer to this commonly as having a governance model in place. The gist behind it is I'm able then to deploy resources going forward. When I detect a misconfiguration, I remediate it, and I feed it back to either the team or the way that those resources get deployed, ensuring that that misconfiguration doesn't happen again. Governance. It's also about evolving that security baseline. And I have some bad news. It's like going to the gym. You need to do it constantly. There are a couple of different reasons for that. We don't live in a vacuum, that's for sure. So new resources get deployed. Nowadays, some folks are even able to, a marketing department is able to spin up machines using their own personal card. And because of that, it's really important to then continuously evolve the security baseline and best practices you have to deploy cloud resources going forward. What's interesting is, and I'll be the first one to admit, this can at times feel like playing catch up. I believe Patch Tuesday is a good example, where you're going to be notified that, let's say, your VMs have known vulnerabilities, so you need to patch them, only to discover that, let's say, in 1 month's time, you're going to have to do the same action all over again, not taking into consideration all other priorities you may have inside of the company. There's also one other thing, and it's very similar to the way that the Security Operations Center functions. Have you ever noticed that even when we're talking about cloud infrastructure security, similar to a SOC, the folks who detect misconfigurations and threats are not the same folks who go about remediating them. So inherently, you need to work with different folks inside of your organizations. These tend to be referred to commonly either as workload, resource owners, cloud practitioners, who own those specific resources and services deployed in the public cloud. So think about that. You detect it, but then you need to go and you need to work with Alice and Bob, let's say from the digital platforms team. This makes security inherently a team sport. What always needs to happen is every misconfiguration needs to have an owner. So you need to know who's remediating that. Is it one person? Is it an entire team? And until when? And that needs to be in a timely manner. A lot of organizations already do this. Some have change management processes in place for it. Others even are using IT service management systems. I saw ITCMs can be of real help holding different workload owners accountable by ensuring they have visibility of what needs to be remediated and until when. Now, up to this point, we spoke about deployment. We spoke about detecting misconfigurations, prioritizing, feeding that back to how resources are deployed. I'd also like to share with you that that's unfortunately not good enough, because it goes back to playing catch up. What can help prevent this is to integrate with pre-deployment. Now, this can be a whole different session on its own. There are a couple of concepts here you might already be familiar with on this slide because they are typically used to automate the way that resources get deployed into public cloud environments. One I believe is particularly interesting is infrastructure as code that allows you to describe the desired state of your cloud infrastructure resources as code in something referred to as templates. Now, templates can be public cloud provider specific, Bicep, ARM for Azure, CloudFormation for AWS. They can be also agnostic, a good example being Terraform. There are definite advantages of this approach because then you're able, after you describe the desired state of your infrastructure resources, to put those templates under version control, meaning you can then track changes to it. Then you can also integrate with something referred to commonly as CI/CD platforms that allow you to then programmatically deploy and test that code in your environment. Now, what's also important to note is when you go about doing that, there always should be a series of security checks done. Be it on the code itself that, let's say, the development team is using to create images, as well as security checks as resources get deployed programmatically to the cloud. There is a term here that the industry uses that's called gating. The idea behind it is to ensure if you detect something that's, again, exploitable, that you can then ensure that it doesn't get deployed into your environment. So you don't need to then detect misconfigurations later on that have a vulnerability, etc. So you're able to stop that deployment in its tracks. What's also interesting is when you think about drifts. A way to imagine drifts is, and I see we have a hand raised. Go ahead.
Can I speak on the question?
Yeah.
Vezano uz infrastructure as a code. Mislim da pogotovo možda oni stanovi smo poslovanju, ali možda manje firme i srednje, bi imale tu issue sa resursima zapravo kako to handlati. Iziskuje nekakav tim i nekakve alate koje bi verificirali takva stvar.
I'll try to sum that up and paraphrase it in English for the recording later on. So there was a really good comment made about that infrastructure as code might be particularly challenging for small and medium businesses because it's going to imply having necessary skill sets, even people to do this. I can agree, but it goes back to doing more with less. So even those organizations need to be mindful of then prioritization. So even if they're not able to employ an infrastructure as code principle, then they need to be really mindful of how they go prioritizing and really understanding what's risk or considered to be risk in their particular environment. The point I'm trying to make with pre-deployment is to make the conversation a little bit wider and saying by shifting a left, so by embedding security as early as possible, it's also possible then for those misconfigurations not to happen in the first place. And I agree with you. It goes back to also having a dedicated function or dedicated team that has that kind of a particular expertise. What I, however, see is even if one doesn't have, folks who are tasked with infrastructure as code, there's still ways to detect when resources get deployed if they're not adhering to the desired state, meaning if they're drifting. There's also a way to ensure that you're able then to monitor the environment. So that's a big point. While all of this, you should always look to adhere to security best practice guidance, which can also change when you, as we go forward, and it can also differ between different public cloud providers. It's very important, however, that you also monitor the environment for potential signs of compromise. So suspicious activities that can be indicative of an attack. Just because an RDP, let's say, port on a VM is left exposed and that VM has a vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be exploited. It is a risk to your environment, as we saw. But that's why you also need to have a monitoring capability to understand if someone is actually trying to exploit that in your environment. So that would be an additional thing to consider just even beyond just infrastructure as code as such. Now, that's also a great point. How do you go about ensuring that this is enforced? There was a talk yesterday by, I believe, one of our keynote speakers, which said that oftentimes security is perceived as the antagonist of productivity. So how do you then go about creating awareness around the need for this with senior management? This actually brings me also to a very important thing is when you look at organizations who do this well or better than others. By this, I should say that approach cloud infrastructure security and are able to have a better infrastructure security, cloud infrastructure security than some other organizations. A big part is leadership. Interestingly enough, while the industry is full of jargons of different tools that can be used for any of this, be it to understand risk in your environment, be it to integrate it with pre-deployment, security hygiene remains the least attractive yet highly efficient thing you can do to ensure a baseline of security in your public cloud environment and to minimize the risk of it being compromised by threat actors. So one might ask themselves, what is then the challenge with seeing this implemented? And I believe the gentleman there actually alluded to a great point. Oftentimes, it has to do with a leadership buy-in. I saw great projects that had the necessary skill sets in place, the tools, the processes were being developed. I mean, it looked all great. One thing they lacked. They didn't have the buy-in from the upper leadership. They weren't able to implement security in their public cloud environment effectively. They were able to make headway, they were able to capture some progress with regards to KPIs that they defined, but they weren't able to, as the Americans say, to knock the ball out of the ballpark. The reason being is that, and I have it here, that a leadership buy-in matters greatly. Upper management buy-in matters greatly, and there are a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, it helps to create awareness about either new vulnerabilities, about risk to the environment, helping then quantify why is specific number of hours needed to address this when, let's say, Alice and Bob from the digital platforms team could be actually working on a brand new application that's generating revenue. You could argue that if we don't secure the environment, there might not be any revenue at all. So while Alice and Bob could actually go and build a new feature or a new app for a new process that could generate, let's say, 10% more revenue year over year, there is a real fear, the business might, go to zero if there is a ransomware attack. What can help by having clearly defined, and some also refer to it as sponsors, so having leadership sponsors, meaning having people or a person inside of the leadership group that is the sponsor for that particular project. In addition to creating awareness at the leadership table, that person is able to do something else for all of us here. Because, again, the folks who are tasked with detecting misconfigurations are not the same folks who are tasked with remediating them. You inherently need to work with others. Now, we could all say, look, we detected the misconfiguration. Alice and Bob, here you go. If Alice and Bob are not able to implement that, we're back at square one of having a huge problem for the overall organizational security posture. Now, this is also to say that because of that, it's also important to ensure that the leadership sponsor then also is able to advocate for this with their peers, like Alice and Bob's management, of why these particular misconfigurations need to be addressed. If I was to put everything together that we spoke about here, I would like to leave you with that ideally, you should have a capability in place that's able to do security checks as early on as possible, ideally even prior to deployment. Now, these security checks should ensure that you don't find yourself in having cloud infrastructure resources deployed that either have known vulnerabilities, are exploitable, or don't adhere to your security governance model or security hygiene. There is also a need then after you detect misconfigurations to remediate them. I would like to also encourage you to remediate based on actual risk to your environment. some misconfigurations tend to be riskier than others. For example, do you consider open RDP port on a VM to be a more riskier configuration than not having logging enabled? So there is also homework needed, I'll call it such, of understanding what resources can cause business impact and then defining what you consider to be exploitable in your environment. Ideally, you should also have something that can monitor the environment for potential signs of compromise while you go about remediating resources. If someone is performing specific activities on those resources that are indicative of sign of compromise, there ideally should be ability to detect this in your public cloud environment as well. And then again, feed all of those learnings, what was misconfigured, into how your organization goes about deploying resources going forward, ensuring they're deployed adherent to security best practice guidance, or as some refer to it, secure by default. I can't emphasize this enough. A leadership buy-in matters greatly. If your leadership team is not aware of what you're doing, I would really love, and I can also stay a little bit later on to discuss about some tactics and ways to create awareness about that and ensure they're also bought in. Now, before I promised I won't go over, so I want to keep my promise. I want to see what other questions you have for me today. It can be either in English or in Croatian. To ensure there are at least some questions, I'm going to give away free ebooks for the first 3 questions we have in the room. So who has the first question? You'll get an ebook then.
Thanks.
Can I make a comment on his questions?
Sure thing. I believe we also have the mic if you'd like to use it.
Sure. Effectively, I'm coming from an environment that you just mentioned. I am a one-man band, and I have one virtual machine in the cloud. So, A, infrastructure as code really means describing your resources as a text file, which means that when you have to deploy the second resource, you don't have to guess what you did in the past. You don't have to click through the GUI and try to find all the options. You have the text file. That is a huge time saver. So you have to invest first into learning how to do that. Yes, it takes you a week. But after that, it's a huge time saver. You don't have to do anything else that he told you about. Just make sure that you know what you have deployed and that is defined somewhere that you can look at, that you don't have to click through the GUI and figure out in which screen that one option is. When you have to deploy the second VM, you will be grateful to your past self. The second thing, what you can immediately add to that is version control. And honestly, being a one-man band, I couldn't imagine working without Git anymore. Because you can always go back in the past and you can see when you made the change, why you made the change, what exactly the change was, and you can always go to any prior version of your source code or infrastructure definition at any time. And that's, I can't tell you how many times that saved my ass. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your perspective. I agree with almost everything you said. I obviously don't agree with the part that this didn't bring value, but I'd like to also share with you another perspective. Is you made a really good point about having accountability, the sole accountability inside of an environment. From a leadership perspective, however, what happens if you have, let's say, like Mr. Ivan here, what when he moves on? So let's say now he's approached by a different organizations who said, Ivan, we, need your skill set. We are willing to offer, 50, 60% more. What happens then? If that person goes, and if that person doesn't have, to your point, templates defined, processes in place, they're effectively packing your overall cloud infrastructure security in a bag and taking it with them out the door. While I really don't want to shy away from the real challenges here, because there are plenty. It's like the threat landscape just keeps on evolving. And we covered this, many other speakers covered this today as well. I see two trends, both of which are alarming, that we see an increase in number of attacks and in their sophistication. So the threat actors, what they used yesterday, it's not probably going to be the same thing they're going to use tomorrow. They are going to evolve. They are going to change. And there are different ways we're thinking about how we can potentially mitigate this, solve it. Is it going to be like auto-remediation? For Ivan, for example, after he's defined everything, if he's only one, can we give him an auto-remediation capability, automation capabilities to help address this at scale across the environment? So that's one approach. Then we all have this whole AI concept now about summarizing everything, empowering the cyber defenders. But at the same time, I want to really acknowledge the pain. Because again, we live in an environment. And I want to also share with you, especially Fortune 500 companies, they also need to do more with less. So if they have, for example, 50,000 VMs, they're not able to address all of those misconfigurations. And we're going to come to the question as well. I just want to add, while you might think that it's actually the grass is greener on the other side, so let's say the bigger players are able to address it, that's never the case. So it all goes back to prioritization, and it goes back to your point, how can you ensure that security is built in and you have a consistency across the environment, especially if you're going to grow the environment, and we see a lot of organizations doing. There was another question. Go ahead, please. Would you like to grab the mic as well?
Hi, I'm Ivan.
Ah, another Ivan. Nice to meet you.
It's okay.
Yeah.
What can you say about security measures that prevent data loss, unauthorized data loss in public infrastructure?
It's a real interesting one because there are a couple of different ways to take data loss at its face value. Before, I don't believe that encryption is the measure that organizations should resort to first. There's still this misconception about, hey, let us just encrypt things. And there are a lot of different vendors at this even conference specifically that have a really interesting software to do that. The thing I see with data loss, it's unfortunately, is a lot of organizations don't do their due diligence. What I mean by it is when you go, and there are a lot of actually different people I spoke to about this, when they actually say, why did data loss happen? They said the organization wasn't actually aware that this was sensitive data to them. So a lot of organizations need to actually work, and a lot of them even have external consultants for that work with them in understanding what data do you consider sensitive. If they don't do that, then chances are, as workloads are being moved to the cloud, and I see another question here, we're going to come to that, as organizations move data to the cloud, if they didn't do their due diligence of understanding what data we consider sensitive, they're already playing with a handicap, because chances are that data is going to find itself into resources in the cloud, which if aren't properly configured, then it goes back to what we spoke about today. So I don't believe encryption is the answer. I do see a need for encrypting a certain percentage of data in cloud resources, but let me ask all of you, how much of a percentage would you say that companies do encrypt data in the cloud? Can I see a show of hands who thinks it's more than 50%? 40? 20? 1? Yeah.
When we spoke about technology. So the man said that only top 5% of company encrypts their data in cloud.
It's because, and to your point, and I know we also have a question here, we're going to get to that as well, it's because a lot of organizations don't do their due diligence of understanding what actually is considered sensitive information for us, then to discover, classify it, have different ways to do it. Because encryption is not a solve-it-all. encryption, to your point, can only address what you want to for it to be confidential. But what about integrity? What about, you know, it being in the public cloud? So those are all of the things I believe the organization needs to define first before you even look at different technologies that can do that. Unfortunately enough, that doesn't happen enough. So you're going to have, and it was a real world example that I provided. You're going to have a department inside of a company move data to the cloud, and then the security folks are going to be, why is sensitive data in the cloud? And we had no idea this was being done. So it goes back to doing due diligence and having a mechanism in place that can detect that, especially for large environments. Okay, so we have one book, and there's going to be, I believe, a third question and the third book. So go ahead.
Ja ću na hrvatskom. Slažem se da enkripcija ne može sve spriječiti i riješiti, ali jedino enkripcija od korisnika i organizacije može spriječiti da informacije koje su senzitivne iscure van zbog priča od cloud providera. Imali smo nedavno situacije gdje su, znači možeš imati best security practice, najbolju higijenu, all by the books, security measures, i onda ti neko uzme ključeve od cloud providera i potpisuje requeste i tokene. Po mom mišljenju, tu nas može spasti samo dupla enkripcija, to je enkripcija vlastitih podataka prije nego što se stavlja u cloud.
So just to kind of paraphrase it, a lot of great insights as well here about, and I believe the core comes to what we all about are here. That's why you have so many sessions in this conference. Because there's really this need to have a defense in depth mindset. So to have several security measures, several security controls. It's not to negate the benefit of encryption, of digital rights management, for example, enforcing that. It's also to share that's not a solve-it-all. It really should go back to the organizations themselves saying what is considered sensitive data. So we have a third ebook that goes here as well. Before I get kicked off, because I believe we are only, I have only 15 seconds left, the last thing I want to leave all of you today is with this definition by NIST. I want to encourage you to reflect after our conversation today, what are some additional practices you can do to ensure that some common cybersecurity incidences don't occur in your environment. With that, I really thank you for taking the time and for being with me today.